On the other hand, in the case where you have to, for instance, perform a movement that you decide yourself, so you're not supposed to grasp for a specific object, but you just have to perform a movement that you decide upon yourself. You can actually see that if you measure activity with the EEG equipment, as we showed last time, and you ask subjects either to press, for instance, they can press whatever time they want to press on either with their left or the right finger. You can see that if you measure EEG, you will see that actually almost 1 second before they start to perform the movement, you will see increased activity of some of the more frontal and medial areas of the brain, so the supplementary motor areas, and only just right before you then do the actual pressing of either the left or the right button, you will see that that the activity gets shifted towards one side or the other, and this has been is actually somewhat controversial, because normally when we perform a voluntary movement, we sort of have the idea that we control performing the voluntary movement, and that we decide that, okay, now I want to actually do something, and I decide to do it. But if you then ask subjects when they actually decided to do it, you will see that they actually decide to perform, for instance, pressing left or right button maybe a few hundred milliseconds before they actually do it. But you will still see that the activity of the frontal regions, they start to increase even up to 1.5 seconds before they actually, or maybe a second before they actually make the decision to do this. So there is some evidence suggesting that these frontal regions, they sort of make the decision before you actually become aware of you want to make the decision. And this is in particular some of the more prefrontal region, lateral prefrontal regions, and then these decisions, whether you want to move or not, is then sent to pre-supplementary motor area and the dorsal premotor cortex, and finally to the primary motor cortex. So in contrast to these visually guided movements, which seems to be highly involving the ventral premotor cortex, these more internally generated movements seems to involve prefrontal and pre-supplementary motor areas. Some have even suggested that you can, with sophisticated techniques of decoding brain activity, they suggest that you can actually see 8 seconds before you decide to do a movement, which movement you want to do. However, if we look more into the data, you will see that, okay, they only perform maybe at 60% correct level. So it's just, I mean, 50-50 would be just by chance. So it's very little evidence that suggests that you decide 8 seconds before. But nevertheless, it's interesting that it's at least not just a chance, but way before you actually think that you decide to perform one type or another type of movement, that these regions seem to code that specific movement. Finally, I just want to tell you briefly about some of the other regions that are involved in motor control, because the basal ganglia, as we also discussed slightly, or at least we saw them during the first lecture with the anatomy. The basal ganglia, that consists of, can you remember which parts they are? Yes. And what's the striatum? It's also 2 other regions that together are called the striatum, because they are connected. Sorry? Yes, exactly. And then we have the globus pallidus and the substantia nigra. And what the basal ganglia is able to do is actually that there are pathways where the basal ganglia receive information from the cortex, and then the basal ganglia seems to be able to differentiate whether it wants to actually perform the movement or not. So it gets some information about that now, and movement is going to happen, and it can then select through two pathways, either the direct pathway going here, which is an inhibitory pathway. So first this part is inhibited, which then inhibits this part. So these signals will then either allow the movement to take place or not, or this indirect pathway. So there is this selection of movements that can take place in the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia seem to have a lot to do in, for instance, movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease. So it's actually a malfunction of these structures that seem to be the reason why Parkinson patients, for instance, have difficulties in actually initiating movements in certain types or inhibiting the right movements. So some make involuntary movements that they don't want to do, but this system of actually being able to inhibit certain types of movements is not well functioning in the Parkinson patients. Finally, there is also the cerebellum, which is involved in controlling and modulating the output from the primary motor cortex. And what it actually seems to be doing is that whenever you try to perform a movement, you will also try and code what are the consequences of this movement. So you will have an idea that whenever I reach out towards maybe this adapter, well, it has a certain weight, and therefore I have to do a certain amount of force, apply a certain amount of force in order to actually perform this. And I make then a prediction of how much force I should apply to this adapter. And then the cerebellum seems to then be used in order to try and calculate if there is a discrepancy between my expectancy of how much this weighs and then what I actually receive as a sensory input when I lift this up. And then it can then, if there is a discrepancy, so if this was much lighter than I had expected it to be, like when you take the almost empty milk bottle out of the refrigerator, you suddenly have to stop doing as much force as you used to do. And it seems that the cerebellum is highly involved in making this calculation. Okay, there is a discrepancy between what I expected and what I'm actually doing, and I therefore have to readjust my movement. And this can then also be used to learn new movements, and it also seems that the cerebellum is involved in these types of movements. So looking at the final picture here, we have a lot of output coming from the primary motor cortex that is sent to the spinal cord in order to make the contractions of the muscles. But at the same time, we also have all these modulatory regions of the brain, basal ganglia, the cerebellum, which can then modulate the output from the primary motor cortex and adjust movements, so deciding whether you actually will do the movement or not, or how much you should perform. So it's not just one single output region from the primary motor cortex. It's always being evaluated and adjusted slightly, and these evaluations and adjustments, they take place at a lot of different parts of the central nervous system. So even at spinal levels, there seems to be adjustments of the ongoing movement. So yeah, by that I will stop and hear if there are any questions.